For those who don't know me, I'm Andrew. I write with National Geographic Learning series Outcomes, and I need to thank them for sponsoring me today. I'm also a teacher, teacher trainer, and slightly unexpectedly have become a director of a new school as well, which is slightly scary, and called London Language Lab. Now, in all of these areas, and I guess for everybody, level is a kind of the concept of level, or trying to think about level, is a kind of central part of what we do, whether you're a teacher deciding what to choose to teach, or a school manager deciding your curriculum. Now, in recent years, our levels, I suppose, have been kind of put cat amongst the pigeons by the CEFR. And we had that introduced, turn of the century, and I think it's a good thing. It kind of worked around this what enabling students to do, so thinking about outcomes in a way for students. But for those of us maybe who've been teaching before or over a long period, how did that fit into our syllabus, which was basically teaching grammar, rules, and maybe a few words if you get the chance? Did the CEFR? Yeah, we've got this new B1 level. What does that mean in terms of actually what I teach? Maybe it helps me thinking about an outcome or what a can-do statement, but how does the language match with that? And what we've seen over recent years is several organisations producing kind of inventories of language items to try and match these with the CEFR levels. So at this conference we've seen, I think Pearson have introduced their vocabulary profile type of thing. I've forgotten what it's called. There was another one on the grammar profile I went to. And I think for publishers, that's it's a really good thing. They liked this idea because it enables them to say, well, in my book, I will teach you B2 level, because it's proven by this inventory. And it also maybe helps if you have these kind of multiple author series, where the authors are all writing at the same time. Maybe it helps also in terms of the vocabulary particularly, of defining vocabulary to a level, so there's no kind of crossover, and we can say you're doing B2 levels words and you're doing B1 level, and the two things won't coincide. Now, as an author, I've had occasion sometimes to, in a positive way, of thinking, yes, this proves my point, but it doesn't match with what the publisher would like. And other times thinking what I want to write clashing with the inventory, and I have a certain kind, particularly with the vocabulary, as we'll see, some certain caution about it. So first, before I'll get on to that, I did a kind of short survey to see how people viewed these profiles, and get a feeling about whether people shared my concerns in a way. So I first I sent the survey to a lot of 43, well, it was probably a bit more than this. It was a chain of schools to the directors of studies. They were very generous in answering. And what was interesting, 84% never used the BC equals grammar, where it is the inventory. So this is one of the inventories of language, which has come out. 79% never used the EVP. So they basically hadn't heard of it. It just wasn't on their radar. And course books basically driving both the grammar and the vocabulary. Vocabulary plus because, they said that the teachers were free to add to the course book. So that's, it's interesting to see how much course books are driving language and the kind of syllabus. But I'm not going to say whether that's a good or a bad thing at this point. I'll leave it for you to decide. But it is interesting in terms of what we'll come on to, which is kind of what are the problems of the circularity of these inventories. Then I also contacted authors through the ELT Connected Facebook site. Again, very generous, 31 replied. What was interesting there is that the fewer people were aware of the British Council one, because it's more of a kind of grammar-based inventory. A lot of were familiar with the EVP, and interestingly, if those people who use the EVP, as you'll see, that quite a high proportion were asked to use it, quite strictly in some cases, and 42% felt it was flawed in some way. So there was obviously a shared disconnect between how I was feeling about things and how the other authors feel. So let's have a look at what these things are and why positive and negative things about them. I'm going to try and go through it reasonably quickly so we'll have time for questions. So let's see how we go. The first thing to remember is all of these inventories say they're not a syllabus. They say they're not syllabus, but there may be an impact where everybody treats them as a syllabus, which is problematic. If you look at the equals one, this is for A2 grammar. What I find interesting about this, and what I like about it, is there's a lot there. Actually more than you will see in most A2 course books. And interestingly, I went to the grammar profile presentation. One of the things they drew on was the fact that, for example, past third conditionals were quite common in the data for B1 students, but were not generally taught at a kind of pre-intermediate level. So I think that's a good thing. But as you see in course books, if we exclude the kind of general core of stuff which they all do, there's a lot of course books which just don't teach any of these things. Now, personally, I find it amazing that the course book could go through the elementary level, so that principally they've done beginner and elementary and never taught have to. And it's worse than that for me, because it's not simply that they haven't taught it, but probably the students have never seen it, because the publisher push generally is for not to see this language if it hasn't been taught. And I think that's a problem, because it's not simply that we're not teaching it, it's more to the fact that we're not allowing the kinds of conversations where this vocabulary might be, or this grammar might be needed. And the whole point of the inventory is it's working back from the kind of conversations the students might want to have, or we expect them to be able to do at A2, and coming up with the kind of grammar that we might expect to see. So it's just, for me, the problem is less the fact that we should expect our students to be able to produce this stuff, but it's the fact that we're not allowing them to be able to have those conversations and do them in the best way they can. And I think this is the key point, and it's a very excellent point made in the inventory itself. That it's created for us in mind, but the key point at the end there is what we teach, what the learners can do with language, and what we test in the examinations are not always identical. So I am not suggesting that we teach all of these grammar structures. But, for example, we might be able to teach phrases which include these grammar structures. We don't have to have a full double-page spread practicing it in various different exercises with productive endpoints, etc. But it could just feature both in the text that students read and in some of the phrases that we teach them. By the same token, we wouldn't expect to test students to be able to use that language. The whole point about an elementary level person, in my view, and if you look at the kind of can-do statements, is that they can do things, lots of things, but in a very basic way. So for me, that might mean you could teach them to have conversations about politics, or about football, or about all kinds of different things, which are not present in many elementary courses, because the grammar syllabus is dictating that we can't have these conversations. What makes the student elementary or A2 is the fact that they just can't do it very well, or they do it with very basic words. Government bad, government good. These could be our basic kind of ideas that I'm going for. But we have to remember, it's not a syllabus. Okay? If you look at vocabulary, that's what they have to say about it. Not so much, it has to be said. But I would say, in their favour, they do have, at the end of the inventory, a kind of list of possible phrases that might be used in certain circumstances. So they are kind of hinting at this kind of phrase, more phrase-based, but certainly at a lower level than perhaps is given. And they're also working on the basis of the idea of it as a framework. So working from the can-do statements and working back to think about the language which might help the students to have these kinds of conversations. So vocabulary is much more a thing focused on in the English vocabulary profile. So this is a Cambridge profile. It's based on the learner corpus, so it's kind of a corpus of about 55 million words, I believe, based on students' responses, productive responses, written responses in Cambridge exams. And they're pegged to the CEFR. So if it's in a PET exam, it will be a B1. If you pass the B1 exam and you used it, essentially that's how they work it out. Again, they emphasise that it's not a syllabus, and that's very important, and it's very fair. But there is also a certain kind of contradictory element to it if you read their website, because they say it describes what aspects of English are typically learned. That doesn't seem to me very kind of balanced, if you like, or hedging. It tells teachers what is suitable for learning at each level. I would like to argue that it doesn't. Cambridge Learner Corpus confirms what learners can and cannot do. And again, I would suggest that it doesn't. It tells us what some learners can and cannot do in Cambridge exams, which is an important distinction, I think. So, I've hinted already, perhaps, at some of the flaws. Let's see how I'm getting on. I'm going to try and give time for questions. So, as we saw, so a lot of our authors were concerned about some of these use of the EVP. And essentially, the concern comes from the publisher trying to use it more as a syllabus than as a guide, I think would be a safe way of saying this. One of the respondents in my survey said, you know, I definitely use it, partly because why wouldn't you use a frequency list of the most useful language? And I basically agree with her, or him, whoever it was, that, yeah, it's good to use a frequency list, but the EVP isn't exactly a frequency list. It doesn't give you information about the relative frequency of words. It kind of just pegs them to a low level or a high level because they've been used in an exam, presumably a certain number of times. I know there's a kind of complex methodology around it, but it doesn't actually tell you how many times compared to other words and overall in their whole corpus. Furthermore, if you look at C levels, they don't include examples which haven't been used less than 14 times. So a C word will be off the list. It could be an off list because it's a proficiency or an advanced student has used it, advanced students in their data have only used it 13 times instead of 15. So this seems to be a bit of a flaw. and the relative frequency of these words is absent. So it's difficult to tell which really are the useful ones. And then when you compare some of the words with an actual frequency corpus, like the British National Corpus, this is based on the phrasesinenglish.org, you could take a word like living room, A1, and that's 11 per million in the BNC. But a word like government, which we can't teach before B1, because it's very complicated, but it's 651 per million. So it's basically 60 times more common in real life, as opposed to ELT life. And similarly, kick, 54 million, cause, which was actually one of the words which sparks my fury about the EVP, when I was told, you can't use this in an elementary course. It's a B2 level word. How can that possibly be? You know, it's 300 per million. And you kind of think, as we'll see, one of the other problems is that it doesn't take account of your local context. So if you're a speaker of Spanish and you have the word causar, it doesn't, you know, we wouldn't assume that it'd be left all that way. Furthermore, it's a list of produced language rather than receptive. So these are words which occur in the written exams of Cambridge. It's not even spoken exams. So what about all the words which students know which they don't use in a written exam? Think of the kind of tasks we see in our written Cambridge exams. How much freedom do the students have to write and produce all the words that they may be capable of producing? And further to that, some content is excluded. So, this is from the PET. A number of sensitive topics are considered unsuitable for use in preliminary and preliminary for schools. For example, war and politics, to name a couple. I could think of a few more words, which are very common in my vernacular anyway, which would be excluded and be very common, but I won't listen there. So, this is, again, comes from my clash, particularly at the low levels, I would say. I was teaching some group of Turkish teachers very recently. Basically, some of them were A1, maybe, quite a few A2. But one of the highest topics that they wanted to talk about was the political and difficult situation in their country at the moment. Okay? Now, if we accept EVP as a kind of syllabus, which I think is the danger, because there's a kind of, it comes from the course books are treating it as a kind of syllabus, there's a kind of circularity that the exams don't cover these kind of topics, therefore they're not these level words, and therefore the course books don't recognise them as those level words, and this kind of inbuilt thing, then we miss opportunities for the kind of conversation students might want to have and put people off. I imagine for a lot of teachers that won't be the case, because we trust our students, but it's something to be aware of and to account for. And similarly, actually, some exams are excluded at a lower level. So that actually, IELTS was only included, the data was only included for the C levels, so the advanced and proficiency. Now, I was curious, if you read this whole thing, it's quite curious because basically what we see is that some words which were considered C1 level occur at a lower level because students have learned them for the IELTS exam because they're doing academic English. But they're not counted as lower level because they didn't pass them. They didn't pass at that level. Yes? Are you confused? I am. It's kind of like, well, if you're saying that actually we could teach these at a lower level, then why are we describing them at a high level? This makes me wonder, there's a kind of dangerous circularity, but particularly, is there a level for words? Can we actually say there's a level for words? It's a tricky thing, and I'll suggest some further reasons why. From the publisher's point of view, I think the problem is that sometimes we see them as single words. So there's a kind of reinforcing of this idea of the grammar rules that we saw earlier, the grammar structures and the words. And then we have single words. So if we think about collocations, what happens when the collocate of our word is of a different level? Does that mean we shouldn't teach it at that level? It doesn't account for L1 crossovers. So, you know, if you take the word cause, Spanish, and lots of words like this might be seen as a higher level, but they're not accounted for because in the data they have to be spread across all different nationality groups. So again, it's B2, but actually really only B2 for people who don't have a cognate in their own language. It doesn't really take account of this kind of U-shaped learning. What I mean by this is that it doesn't account for the wrong uses of words, or the wrong uses of grammar, in the case of the grammar profile. Now, if somebody uses a word wrongly, to me, that suggests they actually know something about the word. They've seen it, they know how it's spelt, they know it exists, they've just got the wrong meaning in some way. And that, as we all know, is a central part of learning. It's the way it goes. We might expect it. So, again, the question is, from a writer's and publisher's perspective, is when we are teaching, when we have a B2 word in the VVP, when should we be starting to teach it? Surely, actually, we should be starting to teach it in a way at least B1 and possibly A2 as a first instance. Because what we would expect is that the students would just get the meaning maybe initially, they may half forget it, then use it wrongly because they don't get the right collocations or the right usage, but over time they develop it, and when they reach B2 and get it correct, then it is a B2 word. But it's not a B2 word in the sense of learning. It's a B2 word in the sense of success for some students in an exam. So there is this issue, I think, which is still kind of not resolved for actually a lot of us, which is basically I failed miserably to get through it, which is basically we still think of the CFR kind of as a syllabus. The problem with it is that it's a can-do. So when you get to B2, that's what they're able to do. But that doesn't describe the process which has led them to be able to get to B2. So is our B2 book preparing students to reach B2, or is it for people who are at B2 already? And these kinds of, you know, until you are clear about that, then we're getting the kind of, so if we think about it again, if our upper intermediate book, if we're using B2 as our guide from the EVP, to me that is actually slightly wrong because they should be thinking about C1 there. So, something to think about. And then the last thing is high levels just underestimate. There's, I think, 2,000 extra words for advanced and proficiency. And we can see why they're underestimated, because if they don't include less than 14 uses, then we're missing all the other words which students need. Students probably need, and I would say this is an advantage of the Pearson one, they have 20,000 words in theirs, plus a lot of collocations, whereas this one has 6,000 or so. So, in terms of level, the level is depending on the context. It's going to, so are they Spanish speakers or Chinese speakers, whatever it is, do they have cognates in their own language? It depends on the students' interests. If they're interested in politics or skateboarding, skateboarding apparently can be an A1 or an A2 word, I can't remember exactly which. But I mean, if you're not interested in skateboarding, why should that be a mark of your A2-ness rather than a B2-ness? it doesn't take account of the language backgrounds. So for me, what we need to remember is the CEFR is a framework. It's for assessing what students can do. So for me, it's to do first our choice. We need to be thinking about following the needs and wants of our students. So the fact that one of these inventories suggests that it's not at level, if our students want to say it and they think it's useful, then we should follow them. And following that, we may want to revise it and help them learn it better. All topics, for me, can be expressed at all different levels. So, you know, people can have a philosophy conversation at A level. Life, you know, possibly. Life, shit, if you really want to go that way. Some grammar can be taught as vocabulary. So actually, for me, lower levels, we need to be, as is reflected in actually the profiles, we need to be at least introducing, seeing, giving the possibility of this grammar, more of it, more range at a lower level, but in a narrower kind of usage, you know, maybe in this phrase or whatever. We do need to take account of native speaker frequency, because that's what students will be reading in the most part. We should, and I think this is a positive thing about UVB and other types of its kind, is at least they are telling us that vocabulary is important, and even at 6,000 words, that's a good kind of start to suggest to our students that if you want to get good, that's how many you need to be learning. And remember, the last thing is that meaning is just the start. So again, they're fairly focused on meaning, but this is just, you know, we can get the meaning quite quickly. The problem is the usage. And this is what happens over time. This is why we need to actually start teaching some of those B2 level words perhaps at an earlier stage. And use them. I think they're a good guide, despite my reservations, but handle with care. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? We've got a couple of minutes. Yes? Yeah.
And they asked, does this mean when I finish the course I'll be a C1 or am I a B1 plus now? And usually our response is, you are a weak B2 and we will make you stronger.
Yes. So it's basically the difficulty of describing, you know, what do we say to students? I mean, we have this on our course books where we have to kind of think. What we settled for was for people who are around B1 level and would like to progress towards B2. And I think actually that is the most honest and the only thing you can realistically say of any course, let alone it's not to do with just material, but course that you're giving, because the CFR and the levels are to do with what they are able to do. It's kind of independent of your, in a sense, of your input. You know, if the student doesn't study, they could still be one at the end of it, couldn't they? So it's, you know, it's managing those expectations, and I think you're right to kind of to hedge as much as possible and kind of say, you know, it's towards, you know. Yes, so this question is about, if anybody would like to go now, that's perfectly welcome. We can carry on asking questions till the next one. The question was, there's no B2 plus course out there. That the gap between B2, like the upper intermediate and the advanced, is huge. And I think this is one of the issues I was kind of getting at with the C1 levels, that if you're only saying there's another 2,000 words, well, that's just wrong. And the gap between, they shouldn't be even, the number of words in each level. The gap between B1 and B2 is probably several thousand. The gap between B2 and C1 is, you know, it gets basically exponentially greater. And I think this is one of the big things with IELTS exams, and where students are asking to get from 5.5 or 6 to 6.5 and 7. It seems like it's just another half step, but actually it's probably twice the number of words that they need to learn to get to that higher level, just because the words become less frequent, they cover less coverage. So, you know, telling students that, I think, is an important thing. And, you know, sometimes the inventory maybe doesn't always reflect that in this case. Yeah. I was asked, yeah, a bit of a go, yes. The session is at an end, you can finish the work, yeah, sorry. I'll answer your question to you personally if you like. Yes, thank you, sorry.